Welcome. This is Professor Gerda Pujol from the University of Central Florida, and welcome again to the Legal and Ethical Environment of Business. In this video lecture, I'd like to introduce you to perhaps the most fundamental idea in our legal tradition, and that is the idea of due process. Now, to understand this idea, I've taken out one of my prized possessions, my gavel. And I want you to think about what the gavel symbolizes, right? And when the gavel is used. Generally, the idea is the judge will use the gavel to call the court into session, call the court into order. But beyond that, more deeply, why does the judge call the court into session, right? Call the court into order? Well, the idea is due process. That person in that court who's been accused of a crime or some other form of misconduct, he or she has a right to defend themselves in the court of law. And that essentially is due process. That's why it's such an important idea. No matter how heinous a crime you've been accused of, you are entitled to due process. Now, due process appears in our Constitution, in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. And what these amendments say is as follows: no person shall be deprived, either by the federal government or by the states, of their life, their liberty, or their property without due process of law. Now, at a minimum, what this means is when you've been accused of some form of misconduct, think of Mark Zuckerberg when he was accused of creating the face mash. You have a right to defend yourself. And at a minimum, it means you're entitled to know what the charges are against you. Also, you're entitled to a hearing. And finally, you're entitled to present evidence and cross-examine any witnesses that may be brought against you. These are the essential ideas of due process. Now, I will tell you, due process will vary depending on the type of court and depending on the type of accusations that are being leveled. But the basic idea is that you are entitled to defend yourself if somebody makes some accusations against you. Now, to give you an idea of why due process varies, I'd like to really zero in on one specific aspect of due process, and that is the idea of the burden of proof. The idea is that when somebody makes an accusation against you, they, the accuser, he or she has the burden of proof. He or she will have to introduce evidence to back up their accusations. Now, what's interesting about due process, however, is that this burden of proof will vary depending on the accusation, or more precisely, depending on the type of accusation that's brought against you. For example, if you're accused of criminal misconduct, of committing a crime, well, you are entitled to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're accused of a civil wrong, a tort, or breach of contract, things that we'll be studying in this class, for example, the plaintiff, the person bringing the case, must prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. That is to say, they must have evidence that is more likely than not to be true. Sometimes in other types of cases, for example, when the state would like to take parental rights away from a mother or father, the burden of proof is clear and convincing evidence. Or in tort lawsuits involving punitive damages, the burden of proof will be clear and convincing evidence. In other cases, for example, when the police attempt to get a search warrant or an arrest warrant, the burden is much lower. It's probable cause. So there are different burdens of proof in our legal system, but the main idea is this, that it's the accusing party, generally speaking, that has the burden of proof. Now, to give you an idea, I'll end this video lecture by referring to the movie The Social Network. There's a scene in which they reenact the administrative board hearing that's brought against Mark Zuckerberg. And the beginning of the scene has the administrator saying, and I quote, "Mr. Zuckerberg, this is an administrative board hearing. You're being accused of intentionally breaching security, violating copyrights, and violating individual privacy by creating the website facemash.com. Before we begin our questioning, you're allowed to make a statement. Would you like to do so? That, my friends, is really the essence of due process, where you're told what the accusations are against you, and you're given an opportunity, which you're not required necessarily to exercise, right, to defend yourself. Well, thank you for your attention. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the main sources of law. Have a great day and go Knights.